In the book of Daniel, chapter 8, it talks about this vision that Daniel had. And one of the things it says, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. He says, then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw there standing behind the river, there was a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. That's interesting. I wonder, what is this ram? I mean, does it even tell us? What does this ram represent? Well, in verse 20, it actually tells you. It says, the ram which you saw having the 2 horns, well, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Oh, okay. And then later on, after talking about that ram, he says that he also saw a goat. He says, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. A notable horn between his eyes. Well, what is the goat? And what is that notable horn? What is that exactly? Oh, I think it also explains that as well. It says, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. Oh, the kingdom of Greece, okay. And the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. The first king of Greece. Who was the first king of the Greek Empire? I think that's Alexander the Great. And then it says, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, the kingdoms of Media and Persia, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him and attacked the ram and broke his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. There was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. That's interesting. So it's saying that this ram is defeated by this goat with the single horn. So in other words, it's saying that the male goat is the kingdom of Greece, and this goat attacks and defeats this ram. And that ram are the kingdoms of Media and Persia. So it's basically saying that the Greeks, with Alexander the Great leading them, is going to defeat the Medes and the Persians. Okay. Well, that's interesting, because that actually happened in history. That's pretty cool. And then it says something interesting. It says, therefore the male grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Well, if that horn on that goat is Alexander the Great, and then the horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up, it kind of sounds to me like Alexander the Great is replaced by 4 different kings. And that's exactly what happened in history. Alexander the Great was replaced by his 4 generals. As a matter of fact, that's actually something that I had just learned about. I had just watched these documentaries. One about Alexander the Great by the BBC, and then this other one called The True Story of Alexander the Great by the History Channel. And they talked all about Alexander defeating the Persians, and then Alexander died at a young age, and he was replaced by his 4 generals, by Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. And that's pretty cool to think that these documentaries from BBC and the History Channel actually confirm the history that Daniel had actually prophesied about. That's incredible. The thing is, though, is why isn't this history in the Bible? I mean, why do I have to rely upon secular historical sources in order to figure out biblical prophecy? I don't know, that seems kind of weird. I mean, shouldn't this history be in the Bible? I mean, why do I have to rely on secular documentaries to figure out biblical prophecy? That just doesn't make sense. This is called the New American Bible. This is a Catholic translation. And there's this one book in here. It's called the First Book of Maccabees. And in chapter 1, it starts off by saying, after Alexander the Macedonian, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, he became king in his place, having first ruled in Greece. He fought many campaigns, captured fortresses, and put kings to death. He advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plunder from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. He collected a very strong army and conquered provinces, nations, and rulers, and they became his tributaries. But after all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. He therefore summoned his officers, nobles, who had been brought up before him from his youth, to divide his kingdom among them while he was still alive. Alexander had reigned 12 years, and then he died. So his officers took over his kingdom, each in his own territory. And after his death, they put on royal crowns, and so did their sons after them for many years, causing much distress over the earth. And so Alexander is replaced by his generals. Well, that's interesting, because here I was just thinking that I shouldn't have to rely upon those secular documentaries to figure out biblical prophecy. And there should be a book in the Bible that contains this history. And I come to find out there is a book of the Bible that contains this history. 1 Maccabees chapter 1. It says that Alexander was the king of the Greeks, and he defeated the Persians and the Medes. And then his kingdom is divided up among his 4 generals. The horn is broken off and replaced by 4 other horns. The four generals who replaced Alexander. In the book of Daniel, chapter 11, it also prophesies about this. Because it says, behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th will be richer than them all. And then after that, it says, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. This is the single horn breaking off, the mighty king of Greece. The single horn, and that horn is broken off and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. The kingdom is divided up among his 4 generals, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. Wow. So Daniel chapter 11 also prophesies about Alexander the Great being the king of Greece, and he will defeat the Persians. But then he will die, and his kingdom divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. The single horn is broken off and replaced by 4 horns, the 4 generals of Alexander. So it says, therefore the male goat grew very great, and when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So it's saying that out of these 4 horns, out of one of those 4 horns, there came a little horn. Now who is that little horn? If only my New King James Bible would give me some kind of marginal note telling me what this is talking about, but there's just there's no marginal notes. I mean, there's nothing explaining it. Oh man, if only I had a marginal note to tell me what it's talking about. What is that little horn? I guess I'll never know. It says, "As for the broken horn and the four horns that stood up in its place, four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. The four kingdoms that came out of Alexander the Great's kingdom: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus." And then it says, "In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes." Okay, this is talking about that little horn. "And he shall destroy fearfully and prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. And through his cunning he shall cause deceit and prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken without human means." Well, I still don't know what or who that little horn is. Too bad there's no marginal notes telling me. But here's the 1611 King James Version. This is a photocopy replica of the original King James. And when you look it up, in the old King James, in verse 25, it talks about this little horn. And it says, "Through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart." So it's talking about that little horn. And, oh, look at that. There's a marginal note. 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 9. Oh, look at that. The original printing of the King James has a marginal note telling me who that little horn is. Well, that's convenient. So when talking about this little horn, where the marginal note is found, it says, "He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken without hand." And that's where the marginal note is referencing 1 Maccabees 6:9. So it's talking about the death of that little horn. Back in this Catholic translation, in 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 9, this is what the King James was referencing. Chapter 6, verse 9, it talks about the defeat and the death of Antiochus IV. So they're basically saying that Antiochus is that little horn. It says, "There he remained many days, overwhelmed with sorrow, for he knew he was going to die." That little horn is broken. So the King James Bible references the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 6, verse 9. So the King James translators believed that that little horn from Daniel chapter 8 is Antiochus IV. This guy is the enemy in the Hanukkah story. This guy is to Hanukkah what Darth Vader is to Star Wars. Antiochus is the enemy in the Hanukkah story. This is called the Kingstone Bible. It's basically the Bible, except it's kind of like a comic book. It's very well illustrated. It's pretty amazing. And I'm in the book of Daniel right now. He says, "2 years later I had another vision, a ram with two horns, one which grew longer than the other. The ram did as he pleased and became very great. The Medo-Persia with Persia becoming larger and greater." And then it says, "While I was wondering about this, a goat with a large horn between his eyes appeared from the west so swiftly that it didn't even touch the ground. He charged into the ram and broke off both of his horns." And it explains down here the swiftness and strength of the armies of Alexander. So these guys seem to understand that this goat with the single horn is Alexander the Great. And he's defeating the Medes and the Persians and tramples their horns, tramples the Medes and the Persians. And then he says, "At the height of his power, his horn was broken, and in its place grew four horns. One became strong and warred against Israel." He says, the near fulfillment of this was Antiochus Epiphanes, who abolished the daily temple sacrifice in Jerusalem. He sacrificed a pig in the Jewish temple and set up a statue of Jupiter there. It says, he even challenged the commander of the army of heaven by canceling the daily sacrifices offered to him and by defiling his temple. And they've got a picture here of King Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's sacrificing a pig on the altar, and he's got this statue of Jupiter. Really amazing illustrations. Underneath that, then I heard two of the holy angels talking to each other. How long will it be until the daily sacrifice is restored again? How long until the destruction of the temple is avenged and God's people triumph? And this is coming from Daniel chapter 8. He says, 2,300 days must first go by. And then, what is this, the angel that Daniel sees? As I was trying to understand this vision, suddenly a man, or at least he looked like a man, was standing in front of me, and I heard a man's voice. Gabriel, tell Daniel the meaning of this dream. And then he says, I was terrified and fell face down. This is Daniel, and he's falling face down before this angel. He says, you must understand that the events you have seen in your vision will not take place until the end times come. He says, I had fainted, but he roused me with a touch. The vision concerns the last days of the coming time of wrath. The two horns of the ram you saw are the kings of Media and Persia. The goat's horn, replaced by 4 smaller horns, means Greece will break into 4 sections with 4 kings, none of them as great as the first. So they've got a picture here of Alexander the Great on his horse. And it says, Alexander the Great, after his death, 4 of his generals became 4 kings over 4 sections of the Greek Empire. It's talking about Ptolemy and Seleucus, Cassander and Lysimachus. And then, what do we got up here? Who is that? He says, toward the end of their kingdoms, an angry king shall arise to power with great shrewdness and intelligence. His power will be satanic. His power will be satanic strength and not his own. It says, the near fulfillment of the prophecy was Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a type of Antichrist. The far fulfillment of this was the Antichrist. Okay. So the near fulfillment, so it's like a dual prophecy. The near fulfillment of the prophecy was Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a type of Antichrist. And then the far and the future fulfillment is the Antichrist. Isn't that interesting? So Antiochus Epiphanes from the story of 1 Maccabees is kind of a picture of the Antichrist. Too bad most people haven't read it. It's going to be kind of hard to recognize the Antichrist when it comes when you haven't read the book of 1 Maccabees, where Antiochus is a type of the Antichrist. So much for being prepared for that. What does it say? He will be a master of deception, defeating many by catching them off guard as they bask in false security. Without warning, he will destroy them. So great will he fancy himself that he will battle the prince of princes, but he shall be broken by the hand of God, even though no human means could overpower him. Antiochus died of insanity and a disease of the bowels. The Antichrist and his forces will be defeated at the Battle of Armageddon, Revelation 19. And then down here it says, and then in your vision you heard about the 2,300 days to pass before worship is restored. And it talks down here, it says, this was literal in its fulfillment. The persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes was from September 6th, 171 BC, to December 25th, 165 BC. The Jews celebrated with the Festival of Lights, which is Hanukkah, after the cleansing of the temple led by Judas Maccabeus. And here they are with the menorah, the 7-candlestick menorah. And so they're saying that Daniel chapter 8, 23 to 27, is actually prophesying about Judas Maccabeus defeating Antiochus. reclaiming the temple, purifying the temple, and restoring worship and daily sacrifice in the temple. Daniel is prophesying about the events of Hanukkah. And then I was appalled by the vision and was sick for several days. Then I performed my duties for the king, but I was greatly distressed by the dream and did not understand it. So isn't that pretty cool? That these guys who made the Kingstone Bible, this kind of like a comic book of the Bible, even they understand that Daniel chapter 8 is prophesying about the events of Hanukkah. Even they understood that. So here I was just thinking that I shouldn't have to rely upon these secular documentaries from the History Channel or from the BBC in order to understand biblical prophecy. There should be a book in the Bible that contains this history. And lo and behold, there is a book of the Bible that contains this history. It's been there all along. I don't have to rely on secular history to understand biblical prophecy. I can read the history in the first and second books of Maccabees. This is in the Geneva Bible. This is the Bible that the Pilgrims used when they sailed to America on the Mayflower. And in Daniel chapter 8, chapter VII, that's Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, it talks all about the goat and the horn and his horn breaking off and all of that. And they actually have marginal notes telling you all about this, saying that Alexander overcame Darius in 2 battles. Alexander's great power was broken, for when he had overcome all by the east, he thought to return towards Grecia and subdue them. And then it's kind of hard to read this because it's so faded. He says that is they were famous almost blah, 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 blah. And then he talks about Cassander had Macedonia, Seleucus had Syria, and I can barely even read this. Ptolemaeus had Egypt. But the Geneva Bible has all these marginal notes talking all about Alexander's kingdom divided up into 4 sections, and then the little horn rising named King Antiochus. They have more over here. All kinds of marginal notes giving you all the information. Look at how they say here, meaning great rage, Antiochus should, they're telling you. Antiochus Epiphanes, the guy from Maccabees. I mean, they're telling you all this information. Noting that this Antiochus was impudent and cruel. And look at this. All this information. They're referencing the book of Maccabees right here. And so, the Pilgrims reading back in the days, after they sailed to America on the Mayflower, they got all these marginal notes telling them all about what this is referencing. Referencing Grecia and referencing Alexander, Antiochus, and all that information. They're not left wondering. They've got all these marginal notes giving them all this information. I can barely read it because this isn't a very good copy, but all the marginal notes. Even on the previous page, just tons and tons of marginal notes explaining this stuff. But the modern reader doesn't have any of this. All the modern reader has is this. No marginal notes, nothing explaining anything. Nothing in the margin. Nothing explaining Alexander, explaining the 4 kingdoms, explaining Antiochus. No explanation. No marginal notes. Nothing.